Hey, what is up guys, Murgerman4 here, and today, inspired by the recent classic Doctor Who Blu-rays that have been released over the past year or so, I want to give you my thoughts and opinions on these classic seasons that have been released so far, and from here on out, continue to do so as future seasons are released. For the past couple of years, I've been doing reviews of the new series seasons as they've come out, so I've done all of Series 10 and all of Series 11. And when I did that, I covered each episode individually, and then I did an overall series overview later. Here, I'm just going to do an overall season review for each box set, not really about the actual product itself, but of the seasons, so I can get my thoughts and opinions of the stories, the episodes of the seasons out there. So where else to start but with the first of these box sets to be released? Season 12, the very first season of iconic Dr. Tom Baker. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to be reviewing each and every season of classic Doctor Who as it's released on Blu-ray. And being the fan that I am, I've already seen every one of these stories many, many times over, but these box sets have given me an opportunity to take a look at them in a bit more detail and perhaps have a fresh take on these stories, especially since some of them I haven't seen in maybe 4 or 5 years. But every story with these box sets, I have the opportunity to not only watch the story itself, but watch all of these bonus features about the story and learn more about it, and also watch it, in some cases, multiple times if there are like alternative edits or alternative CGI effects. So I've become a lot more familiar with every story that's been released, even the less iconic ones, thanks to this, because I'm not just watching it sporadically. And before I get into the actual stories themselves, I just want to give a quick reminder about how I tend to rate these stories. I do try to look at them in a bit of a critical light, but my opinions, in Doctor Who anyway, are primarily impacted by entertainment and how much I unironically enjoy a story, not by how many flaws or positives I can find in each one. So without any further ado, let's begin with the season premiere. We start off season 12 with Tom Baker's debut story, Robot. To be entirely honest, for such an important story in Doctor Who's history, with Tom Baker's Doctor being the iconic incarnation that he is, it's really not anything all that special. It is important to note that this story was actually produced by the previous production team from Jon Pertwee's era, before the new one took over in the next story, and so that kind of makes it not really stand out as much. It really does feel like a product of the Jon Pertwee era. And in some ways, that's a bad thing, like how I mentioned it doesn't stand out. In other ways, it is a good thing because it kind of smooths the transition over a little bit more, kind of one last hurrah from the Jon Pertwee era, with Tom Baker thrown into that before he goes off in his own era. So yeah, while it certainly doesn't make it bad, it certainly doesn't make for a bold new start to this new era. However, what it might lack in originality or freshness, it makes up for with its main cast, who are all fantastic. Elisabeth Sladen and Nicholas Courtney are excellent, as they always had been throughout their time in the Jon Pertwee era. And Ian Marter debuts here as Harry Sullivan, who's a lot of fun, and Marter is great in the role. And of course, Tom Baker immediately cements himself in the role, grabbing your attention from the off and never letting go, not once. So while this story does have some flaws, and it's not all that spectacular in really any way other than the main cast, it's still a decently fun story. It's got a lot to like about it. I do really enjoy the production design for the actual eponymous robot itself, and it does a decent job at introducing this new Doctor, and like I said, it does kind of smooth the transition over from the previous era to this new one. So I'm going to give it a solid 7.5 out of 10. Now this is where things really kick off. The Ark in Space is the first story by the new production team of producer Philip Hinchcliffe and script editor Robert Holmes. So Robert Holmes did previously write for the show, but he's now in the script editor position. And so in a way, this is actually the true start to the Tom Baker era, as it would come to be known. So starting with the Ark in Space until the end of season 14, this era is often referred to as the golden age of Doctor Who, and with stories like the Ark in Space, it's pretty easy to see why. For me, I think stories like this are where the slower pace of classic Doctor Who really benefits the story. In other cases, it doesn't always, but here I think it works really well as the thread is slowly built up across the 4 episodes and things seem more and more hopeless gradually over time. It's not all just shoved down your throat really quickly. You kind of get time to soak up the menace and the gradual hopelessness of their situation. The Warren also provide a suitably terrifying threat, even if they aren't realized the most effectively. Bubble wrap. But the set of Nerva Beacon is beautifully realized, and there's some great emotional drama as well. One of my particular favorite bits is Noah's horror of slowly transforming into a monster, with a great payoff of his mind finally beating the invasive worm in the end for just long enough to save the day. This story is exhilarating, terrifying, and revitalizing for a brand new era, and the Ark in Space deserves a very strong 9 out of 10. Highly recommend it. Now we move on to the only 2-part story of the entire decade of the 1970s, the Sontaran Experiment, which personally I think benefits from this shorter length. It's nice to see a return for the Sontarans, and the human experimentation is a great expansion from when we last saw Sontaran in the Time Warrior, their introductory story. But Steyr isn't actually introduced until the end of part 1, and to me anyway, there's not anything particularly notable about anything else in this story. I mean, the guest cast are fine, the location works well enough, but kind of similar to Robot earlier this season, the Sontaran Experiment doesn't really do all that much to grasp your attention outside of the main cast, but in this case it also has the Return of the Sontarans going for it. However, thankfully things do pick up in part 2, where Steyr gets a much meatier portion of the episode, and it builds to a generally satisfying climax for such a small-scale story, bluffing off the impending Sontaran invasion aside that is a bit shoehorned in and a bit of a lazy cop-out. But there's not really too much that could be done with, such a short amount of time to pull off that conclusion. But still, while perhaps it's not particularly memorable, like Robot, it's an entertaining enough story. I think Robot has a bit of an edge because it was the introductory story for Tom Baker, and that plays really, really well throughout the whole story. But this one's pretty close, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Genesis of the Daleks. The Ark in Space may be a classic, but Genesis of the Daleks is the classic. A definite article, you might say. I know, it's the wrong story, but I couldn't resist playing off of that quote. But in any case, Genesis has a lot of hype to live up to. Not only is it without a doubt the most iconic story for the Doctor's most iconic enemy, but it's also one of the most iconic and recognizable stories in the entire history of the show. I don't know if I could have fit any more iconics in that sentence. Genesis goes back to show us the creation of the Daleks and introduces the Whoniverse to Davros, their creator, a character so influential that he would go on to appear in every subsequent Dalek story of the classic series run. Ironically, for a story all about the creation, the Daleks actually don't feature all that much, but that's completely fine because despite what the title may make you think, it's not really their story at all. This story is all about Davros, and rightfully so. Played here by Michael Wisher, who unfortunately never got to play the role again. Davros is presented as a deranged mad scientist, foregoing all morals and determined to win the war against the Thals at any cost, even sacrificing his own people. Genuinely one of the best villains to come out of the entire show. Davros is terrifying, and Wisher gives him a suitably electric performance. When he's in the room, you can't keep your eyes off him. And that's really tough to do when Tom Baker is also in the room with you. The main cast is, as usual, also in suitably excellent form, as are all the guest cast as well. In previous stories, usually the main cast are the only ones who are really that notable of the characters, except for maybe Ark in Space. But here, you've got a lot of really strong supporting characters. My particular favorite being Peter Miles as Nider, who has this pitch-perfect performance, both sly and scary, and a fantastic character to complement Davros throughout the story. And that's without even getting into the fantastically bleak direction and iconic scenes such as Do I Have the Right, with so much of an impact on the Doctor Who universe that a sequel of sorts spawned over 40 years later in The Magician's Apprentice / The Witch's Familiar. It would be remiss of me not to mention that the story isn't perfect. It's a tad too long. The Caledon subplot with Sarah Jane simply isn't anywhere near as exciting as the rest of the stuff, and there is the occasional giant clam. But honestly, they really don't matter in the face of everything else that this story gets so right. A classic, and deservedly so. I'm going to give it a very strong 9 out of 10. Revenge of the Cybermen. Season 12, you were doing so well. Look, Revenge of the Cybermen isn't all that bad, but it's definitely the only real weak link of the season, and one of the worst representations of the Cybermen in the entire show. It's a real shame, too, considering that not only is this their only appearance with Tom Baker during his entire 7-year run, but also their only appearance in the entire decade of the 70s. Admittedly, it does have a couple of good moments. For example, I love the cliffhanger to Part 3. It's genuinely fantastic. But, honestly, throughout the story, I've got no clue what's going on in Voga. The Cyberleader struts around with his hands on his hips and gives the Doctor a vigorous massage, and the music is really clunky and awkward throughout. I can't take this story very seriously, and it's a significant step down from everything else in this season. It's not the worst of the worst. It's, honestly, looking at it on its own, it's not even all that bad, but especially in the context of this season, it's the worst one by a long stretch. And I can't really give it anything more than a 3.5 out of 10. But yeah, that's Tom Baker's first season. 2 classics, 2 solid stories, and 1 disappointment. But overall, Season 12 is a strong success, bar that 1 misstep. As with most seasons of Classic Who, the individual stories don't really come together as a greater cohesive whole, although there is a bit of a loose arc surrounding the Nerva Beacon. But that's okay, because for me, really, I don't really expect it or need it all to come together. That's not really what I'm looking for when I come to Doctor Who. As long as the individual stories are strong, which for the most part they really are, I'm pretty happy. And of course, we have a trio of excellent leads led by the fantastic Tom Baker, who he absolutely shines in his debut season. Elisabeth Sladen, who is effortlessly wonderful as always, and Ian Marter, who despite not having much to do throughout the season, and thus the majority of his tenure, still manages to leave a lasting and charming impression. Overall, a really enjoyable and impressive start to an iconic era. Now, before I finish up, I thought it would be fun to include some statistics at the end of each season. It's something that I personally am really interested in seeing. I like to compare things a lot, especially when it comes to my thoughts on Doctor Who stories. But first, we'll do them specific to this season, and then a wider range, including every season I reviewed up to said point. So obviously this is the first season I'm reviewing, so that second category isn't really going to have that much going on, and there's nothing else to compare it to right now. But we'll see that progress as this series of reviews goes on. But of course, firstly, within the season, we've got my average score and story ranking as follows. On top we have Genesis of the Daleks, closely followed by The Ark in Space. A little further behind is Robot and the Sontaran Experiment, and finally at the bottom is Revenge of the Cybermen. And the overall score, on average, for Season 12 is a 7.2 out of 10. Thank you very much, Revenge of the Cybermen. It does kind of suck because that average score, I don't feel like it represents my overall thoughts on the season. This is definitely one of those cases where I think it is more than the sum of its parts, but even then, the sum of its parts is only dragged down so much by one outlier. So that's a bit of a shame, because the vast majority of this season is so much better than that 7.2 shows. And then for the other assorted statistics that we're going to be using to compare to other seasons, the categories that we have are Decade and Doctor's Eras, both of which are sitting at a 7.2 out of 10. Writers, with the current list being Terry Nation and Robert Holmes with an average of 9 out of 10. Terrence Dix with a 7.5 out of 10, Bob Baker and Dave Martin with a 7 out of 10, and Jerry Davis with 3.5 out of 10. And then producers with Barry Letts at 7.5 out of 10, and Philip Hinchcliffe at 7.1 out of 10. Thanks again, Revenge of the Cybermen. I also want to list specific event episodes, as I'm going to call them, as we go along. So that'll include season premieres, finales, Doctor debuts, and regenerations. The regeneration category is the only one that doesn't start with this season, but everything else is covered with season 12, with robots starting both the premiere and Doctor debut categories at 7.5 out of 10, and Revenge of the Cybermen starting the finales in a grim position at 3.5 out of 10. Thanks again, Revenge of the Cybermen. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Doctor Who Season 12. I hope you enjoyed, and please leave your thoughts on Doctor Who Season 12 below. Next up is Peter Davison's debut season, Season 19. But yeah, Murgaman 4, over and out, and I will see you guys later.